Welcome to Dark Facade, a channel dedicated to looking past the veneer of humanity and finding its true face. I will be your tour guide down this winding path of tales, ranging from the supernatural, science fiction, and twisted love. All the stories you're about to hear are assorted bits of literature that will range from the bizarre to the unexpected. So sit back, lower the lights, and allow yourself to be taken away from everyday reality to its shadowy reflection. If you enjoy our unusual content, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button to receive more. Thank you. The Book of Dark Names by Katie Rogers, read by Katie Rogers, Chapter 17. Sean had been wandering through the maze for what seemed to be hours. It was all so strange. In the blink of an eye, he had been transported from Hectonus' realm to this place. Though he had not gone through any doorway or entry, he knew he was in some sort of maze. When he walked the many corridors, he had encountered dead ends. Whatever games Kadaf was playing, Sean was stuck being a willing participant. The only other alternative was to stand still and do nothing. That was not his style. He pushed onward, using what little light there was to see by until he reached the end. A large doorway led out into a foggy open field. He stood at the threshold, a little wary of what might be out there lurking in the mist. When he saw nothing happening, he decided he had to try. Cautiously, he stepped out onto the shaggy, dew-covered grass. The air was as damp and heavy as the ground beneath his feet. The silence itself was unsettling. He could not really tell what time of day it was. The sky was dim and gave no clue as to whether it was on the edge of dawn or dusk. All Detective Akaike knew for sure was his guard had to be up. He remembered his grandfather instilling this virtue of survival within him. Always listen to your instincts, Sean-kun. They come from here and here, he said, while placing his hand over the boy's heart and stomach. Sean had listened to the old man's advice in every decision he made. This time was no exception. He was in enemy territory, and his chances of survival were low. As he ventured further into the field, he saw two dark silhouettes coming his way. Each of them were carrying weapons. It looked like weapons, of some sort. When the shadows became clear, he saw that they were soldiers from a time long gone by. Union infantry from the Civil War were charging towards him in full force. Their numbers went from several to a countless horde. The expression on all their faces was one ranging from fear to anger, the sort of concoction that adrenaline produces. When Sean looked to his other side, he saw the Confederates meeting them head-on. The same desperate courage was written all over their faces. He scrambled to get out of the way, but was not quick enough. The sounds of guns firing and swords clashing had already begun. Before he knew it, he was standing in the middle of one of America's bloodiest battles, Gettysburg. The sounds of war were all about him as he ran and saw men screaming and being blown to bits by cannons, rifles, and other weapons of the day. The earth, which had been covered with dew before, was now saturated with blood. As he tried to run for cover, he tripped over the headless body of one soldier and fell face first into the shattered guts of another. His screams of horror were lost among the many on the battleground. He clambered to his feet and ran towards the tree line, away from the conflict. The thing was, he knew he was seeing something horrible from the past. All of this madness was a shadow of what had been. Sean's gift had let him see the terrible things people did to one another his whole life. This time, however, it was different. This time he felt the bullets whizzing past him. He smelled the gunpowder and blood. Oh God, the blood. The man's blood, whose entrails he had fallen into, was still warm on his face, and it left a bitter, salty taste in his mouth. As he rushed to what he hoped would be a haven, it began to dry and became sticky. As soon as he reached the trees, the explosive sounds of the war came to a stop. Sean turned back around to let his eyes witness what his ears had already told him. War-torn Gettysburg was no more. The field returned to its ghostly state as the fog rolled in, thicker than before. He wished the sudden quiet could give him some relief, but it didn't. There was tension and stillness, one so thick you could have not cut it with the sharpest of knives. The heaviness lurking all around was the sort one feels before a terrible storm. "Come on," Akaike muttered. "Let's see what you've got." Almost as if the fates had heard him, the anxious man received his answer in the sound of thunder. The heavy air immediately shifted, blowing the thick fog into a frenzied dance. The wind picked up so strong and so fast that Sean had to hold on to one of the trees to remain standing. Above him he saw the dim sky swirl like a tempest in the ocean. The whirlpool, however, was not made from clouds or water, but from time itself. Sean felt himself spiraling upwards into the very heart of the thing. He could no more fight the Charybdis of time than the Greek sailors were able to fight their own. Akaike had barely reached the rim before he was bombarded with terrible images from the past. Everything from slavery, the Trail of Tears, witch trials, and the Holocaust assaulted his consciousness. Just as he experienced with Gettysburg from before, Sean got more of the same from the tunnel. Every shriek of pain resonated within his ears. The stench of burning flesh, death, and blood permeated his nostrils. He saw men, women, and children ripped apart by their fellow man or wiped out by diseases. Yet this dark tunnel had one last torment. All the horror he bore witness to was his to feel as well. Every affliction imaginable set upon his body like a flock of carrion hell-bent on picking his bones clean. The misery became so intense that Sean's mind soon fell into chaos, and the screams that filled his head became his own. If there was a hell, it had found him. When a body experiences more than it can handle, either death or madness comes to roost. He hoped for death. A glimpse of the past came in that was familiar to him. A young boy stared at him with wide, dark eyes from inside a tall chain-link fence. Though he could feel the boy's despair beating within his own chest, he recognized him. The child seemed to know him too. "Shankun, let them go. Let the shadows go. They belong to time, not to you. Let them fade into the dark where they belong." He could hear his grandfather's voice, but he couldn't see him. The child continued to stare at him until at last he spoke. "Shankun, get out. You must get out," he said. "How do I get out?" Sean yelled. "Take my hand, Shankun. I will help you," the child told him while reaching through the fence. Sean was not sure he had the strength to move, but he had to try. The wind was so violent, and it was tossing him about like a ship on a stormy sea. The pain of his body was so excruciating he had to fight to even raise his arm. He missed his target several times before feeling his grandfather's fingers catch. The child delivered him from his torment and put him back at the entrance of the maze. Sean collapsed to the ground, unable to move or speak. His body was so weakened by the pain, he couldn't even form a thought. The dew from the grass felt good against his fevered brow. What he had went through in the tunnel had increased his heart rate so dramatically that he'd sweat through his clothes. He felt himself involuntarily shiver and was afraid he might be going into shock. His eyes became fixed on the darkly lit doorway to the maze. Somehow he knew he had to get back across the threshold. His body, however, was useless. He had no strength in him. In the background he could hear the whirlpool coming for him. He had to move. He had to get back in the maze, but his body could not obey his mind. "Shankun, you must fight," his grandfather commanded. "You have to get back in the maze." The vortex is coming. If it gets you again, you won't live. Fight hard, you have to. I can't, Grandfather, I can't, Sean murmured pitifully. The funnel was sent by him. He sent it to stop you. You're stronger than he is. Fight, Sean-kun, fight. Get back to the maze now. The urgency in his grandfather's voice gave him the shove he needed to go forward. As the funnel came nearer, Sean tried his best to get away. He only managed a few inches before he had to quit. So this is what it was like to be beaten down. In his heart he knew if he were sucked back in, he wouldn't get out. He had to keep trying to move no matter what. Inch by inch he pulled himself over mounds of grass that felt like hills in pursuit of his salvation. The threshold was so near now that he could almost touch it. All he had to do was cross over. He felt the air shift as before and heard the unmistakable sound of the cyclone behind him. The time funnel was near, so he would have to hurry. He managed to muster enough strength to get part of his body in the maze. It proved to not be quick enough, however, and he felt himself being pulled upward. Desperately, Sean grabbed hold of anything he could to keep from being sucked back in. He managed to latch on to the side of the entryway. His strength, however, was not much, and it wouldn't be enough to fight this off. At most, he'd simply be delaying the inevitable. Terror gripped him as he remembered the horrors of the tempest. The swirling vortex of pain closed in to claim its victim at all cost. He fought with every last bit of his strength before finally losing his grip. It seemed the tempest would at last have its victim. Strangely enough, however, he did not go up to the funnel. He hovered just outside the doorway. He managed to squint through the debris and gushing wind to see a face just inside. Then he felt a hand holding his wrist tightly. Someone was in the tunnel. They were all that stood between him and the terror above. The truly frustrating part was he couldn't do anything to help them. His life was literally in their hands. The person inside managed to pull him forward enough that they could grip his shoulders. Then with one last big yank, they got him all the way through. Sean lay motionless on the floor as he listened to the sound of his rescue catch their breath. No, there wasn't just one here with him. It was a group. He turned to see Christopher, Laura, and Richard all lying in a heap against the wall. He had never been so glad to see them in his life. His eyes met Laura's, bringing a smile to his face. "I would ask how you found me, but I already know," he said, giving props to her ability. "Are you all right, Sean?" she asked, noticing his lack of movement. "I will be," he assured her. "What sort of place is this?" Richard wondered out loud. "My best guess is where time stores its darkest memories," Sean answered. The trio only nodded in response. After all they had seen, no further explanation was needed. Christopher noticed the terrible wounds on Sean's body and also observed he did not try to get up or move. He went over and assisted him by setting him up. Akaike grunted in pain but was grateful. "Sean, are you going to be able to walk back through?" Christopher asked, concerned. "I think, at first, I won't, but the further we move into the maze, the more I will heal," he said with certainty. "What the hell happened out there?" Laura asked as she shook her head. "Hell is what happened," he told her. "But before you guys pulled me in, I was in much worse shape. I think the effects of the funnel will wear off the further I get from it." Again, there was no need to explain. Chris and Richard both took a side and helped him to get to his feet. He leaned heavily on his human crutches as Laura led them back through the maze. Their next objective was to find their way back to Daniel. Luckily, Laura would be able to get them there quick.